In this lesson, we'll learn how V-Ray for Maya can actually simulate the effect of beveled corners at render time. Alright, so if you were to open up this scene file and render this out, you can see that we wind up with this fairly simple shape, but what I want to do is come in and now start to add some beveling to some of these hard edges. Now, actually doing this on the geometry itself can be a little bit of a tedious process and definitely requires a little bit of work. But what we can actually do is, if we're using V-Ray for Maya, we can actually have V-Ray start to kind of soften and round out these edges at render time. So to do this, let's select our geometry, go ahead and open up the attribute editor, and with this object's shape node selected, let's go to Attributes, V-Ray, and turn on this Rounded Edges option. Now once we do that, we can see this V-Ray extra attributes is now available to us, and this Enable Round Edges option is turned on. Now right now the radius is set to 1, which this value that you wind up using is going to really depend on the overall size of your object and just how much rounding you want to try to simulate. So with this radius set to 1, looking at just how large one of my Maya grid units is in my scene, that's actually going to be a pretty large rounding effect. So if we were to come in and take a quick look at this, let's just save that image for comparison and re-render this. Once this finishes up, you can actually start to see this rounding effect, but it is definitely a little bit strong and really kind of creating a kind of a nastier look than what we might want. So in order to fix that, let's start to take this radius and begin dropping this down pretty significantly. Let's go ahead and see what this looks like with a radius of 0.1. Again, we can just save that image for comparison and re-render. And once this finishes up, you can see that this is now much better, much more manageable compared to what we had before. Although it may still be a little bit strong, we may still have a little bit of artifacting in some of these areas and some of these corners. We can start to see a little bit of that. So again, if we need to, we can always come back and start to lower this radius a little bit more. So I'll try something like 0.05. And again, re-render. Alright, and once this render finishes up, now this is much better. So some really nice appearance of beveling on these little edges here. Now it's important to note that at render time, V-Ray is not actually adding a true bevel to these edges. Instead, it's just simply using some normal tricks and other bump mapping effects to actually just create the appearance of a beveled edge. So that's why when this setting was set up very high, what we're actually seeing is not necessarily geometry errors, but these are actually normal errors. So things that we would normally see in normal maps and bump maps, it's essentially this type of effect that we're seeing here. So again, really nice feature to be able to have as far as very quickly smoothing out and rounding out some of these edges at render time and creating actually some really nice convincing bevels. Now, a couple of things to be aware of. If we were to actually take this piece of geometry, and let's say we actually wanted to duplicate this and have a second piece of geometry in here. So I'm going to go ahead and press Control D to duplicate this object. Now right now my pivot is all the way down at the ground, so with this duplicate object selected, let's go to Modify, Center Pivot. There we go, that'll now move this center right to the center of my object. Now I'll just take this duplicate and kind of scale it in. Not so much that it's actually contained all the way inside this object, but to where the edges are actually intersecting a little bit. Now if I were to pull my camera back and actually render this out, let's again just save this image for comparison and re-render. And you can see that on this duplicate object, it does have this same rounded edges attribute that's been applied to it. But what if I actually wanted to have these edges round right in this area where these two objects are actually intersecting? Well, V-Ray actually won't be able to do that because this rounding effect is only happening right in the area where we actually have some kind of an edge. So if we were actually wanted to render this little intersection out with a bevel, because there's not truly an edge right there, we would not be able to do that. So a quick and easy way of actually accomplishing something like this would be to use something like a Boolean union. So if I were to shift select these two pieces of geometry, go into my Polygons menu, go up to Mesh, Booleans, and we'll do a union. Now you can see that this new edge has actually been created at the point where these two objects actually intersect. So now let's go back and try to re-render this. we are. So I'm just going to take my camera and try to get this back to where it was. Now, an important thing to take note of is that in actually doing this, we've now created essentially a new shape node. So anytime we do any kind of merging or combining of meshes, you'll notice that now our V-Ray attributes are gone. So on this newly created shape node, we will have to go back and reapply this round edges if we need to. And again, you'll have to remember what setting you used. In my case, I think I was using 0.05. So again, I'm going to take this image, save that for comparison, and re-render. And now, once this finishes up, you can see that now that we have a true edge that was generated right there by that Boolean operation, we now have a nice bevel effect that is occurring between those two pieces of geometry, whereas before, you can see we definitely did not have that. Alright, so that's a look at how we can start to take our polygon objects and start to render these with the appearance of some nice, smooth, rounded, beveled edges inside of V-Ray.